I want to start you at the end of a long road, at the moment a proud man's world came undone. It was the sound that reached him first. Lord Stellan Corv, Earl of Ashenmere, had ridden the better part of 3 days up the wild northern coast, braced in the way a man braces himself when he has done something unforgivable and finally goes to look at what he has done. He had expected silence. He had sent her to a place of silence after all. Grey Marsh, the furthest and most forgotten of his coastal holdings, a salt-sword estate on the grey edge of the sea, where the fishing village had been failing for a generation. The old manor stood half-shuttered against the weather, and the only sounds a person could reasonably expect were the wind off the water and the crying of gulls. That is what he had expected. He heard, instead, hammering. He pulled his horse to a stop on the last bend of the cliff road, where the lane turned, and the full sweep of the cove came into view. And he sat there in the salt wind with his mouth gone dry, and his careful composure entirely undone. Because below him, where he had planted a ruin, something else entirely was growing. The old salt flats, which had lain flooded and useless for 30 years, were working. He could see the channels cut clean and straight along the foreshore, drawing the seawater in controlled and deliberate, and the great flat pans beyond them shining white in the autumn light, piled at their edges with the pale harvest of good salt. The fishing boats. There had been 5 when he last troubled to take account of the estate, and most of those had been rotting at their moorings. He counted 11 now, well mended and seaworthy, moving in and out of the little harbour with the busy purpose of a fleet that knew what it was about. The cottages of the village, which had been dark and sagging, showed fresh paint and new thatch. There was smoke from the chimneys and washing on the lines, and children running on the quay. And set against the old stone wall of the manor, where he had a dim memory of an overgrown tangle of weeds, there was a garden. A vast, ordered, extraordinary garden, laid out in beds with the precision of a map. And even from the cliff road he could see it was no kitchen garden, no ornamental fancy, but something purposeful and flourishing, and unlike anything he had encountered in a domestic setting before. He stared at all of it for a very long time. And then a figure came out of that garden, unhurried, carrying a basket over one arm, and spoke a few words to 2 women working near the gate. Those women looked up, nodded, and went back to their work with the easy confidence of people who trust their instructions entirely. The figure moved on toward the harbour, and even at that distance, after almost 2 years, Lord Stellan Corv knew who it was. His wife, who was supposed to be ruined, who was supposed to be a ghost. I am going to stop us here, right at this moment. Lord Corv, motionless on the cliff road, staring down at a living, thriving, purposeful world where he had meant to bury a woman and be done with her. Before I let him ride down into the reckoning that is waiting at the bottom of that road, you and I have an arrangement to keep. This is Moonlight at Ravenwood, and if you are new to this fire, find the subscribe button and press it. It costs you nothing, and it means the next story finds you the moment it is ready, and there is always a next, my dears. There is always a next. Now come back with me. Before you watch a proud man face what he has made, you need to understand what he threw away, and to understand that, I must take you back to a man who loved a garden. His name was Ezra Bassett, and he was, in his quiet and entirely unfashionable way, one of the most important men in England. Though you would not have found him at any dinner worth attending. Ezra Bassett was an apothecary by training, a botanist by passion, and a genius by the sheer stubborn accumulation of knowledge over 50 years of work. He had begun his career as a young man in a small dispensary in a provincial city, and ended it as the keeper of the most celebrated physic garden in the north of England. 4 acres of carefully cultivated medicinal plants, organized according to a system he had developed himself, tended by his own hands and those of the dozen apprentices he trained every decade. Physicians sent patients to him. Hospitals wrote to him for his preparations. He had turned a raw bog at the edge of his property into productive planting beds by a drainage method of his own devising, bred strains of common plants to yield 3 times the medicinal potency of the wild variety, and published quietly in journals the fashionable world never read, and been respected enormously by everyone who understood what respect was actually for. He had one child, a daughter, and he did with her what every sensible man does with a daughter when he has no son, and a great deal of knowledge he does not want to die with him. He taught her everything. Her name was Imogen, Imogen Bassett, who had grown up at her father's side in the garden and the dispensary and the drying room, who had learned to identify 300 medicinal species by the age of 12, and to prepare their extracts by 16, who understood how land and plants spoke to one another. What a soil wanted, what a growing thing needed, what a neglected place was quietly dying of, and how to bring it back. By the time she was 25, Imogen Bassett could walk into any struggling household, any sick community, any neglected piece of ground, and see with her father's eyes the living, productive place it could become under the right hand. She had inherited his gift entire, and she had added to it gifts of her own, a directness, a steadiness, a way with the people who worked alongside her that made them feel known rather than employed. She was not warm in the way of a parlor ornament. She was warm in the way of the thing itself, of the hearth, of the garden in full summer, of the dispensary fire kept burning through a cold night for anyone who needed it. She had expected, in her own quiet way, to spend her life beside her father's work, and eventually to take it on. She had not expected the Earl of Ashenmere. I will be fair to Lord Corv here, because fairness is the whole of good storytelling, and because what he was is more interesting than simply calling him a villain, which would let him off too lightly. Lord Stellan Corv was not a cruel man in the simple sense. He was a proud man, which is a more complicated thing and more dangerous, because pride can do the work of cruelty, while never once admitting to it. He was 34, possessed of a title that had been illustrious for 2 centuries, and was now, beneath its shine, severely encumbered. He needed money, and he needed it in the form a gentleman could accept, a marriage. Ezra Bassett had recently died, and left his daughter not only his house and his garden, but his very considerable fortune, held, and this is important, so hold it carefully, held entirely in a trust arranged by Ezra's shrewd and cautious lawyers, in Imogen's name alone, bound so that no husband's hand could touch the principal. Lord Corv knew this when he negotiated the match. What he gained was the marriage settlement, respectable enough to ease the most pressing of the estate's debts, and a social connection to a name that, however unfashionable, commanded genuine respect in the circles that mattered to commerce. What he gave in return was the title of Countess of Ashenmere, entrance to the world he moved in, and the promise, implicit in every such arrangement, that the woman he married would be treated as the mistress of his household and the partner of his name. He did not keep that promise, not in any way that counted. It was not that he was unkind precisely, it was that he was indifferent, in the specific way of a man who has decided that his wife's person is less important than her function. He installed Imogen in Ashenmere House in London, in its cold, magnificent rooms, among the cold, magnificent people of his social world, and he expected her to become what a countess was supposed to be: graceful, ornamental, socially correct, and quiet. And Imogen Bassett, who had never in her life been any of those things, who had been raised to use her hands and her mind and her knowledge every waking hour, who had been bred for usefulness the way some women are bred for elegance, found herself with nothing to do, no garden to tend, no dispensary to manage, no patients to see to, no apprentices to teach, no land to read, no knowledge to apply. The Countess of Ashenmere did not make medicines. The Countess of Ashenmere did not dirty her hands in the soil, or discuss drainage with labourers, or spend her evenings cataloguing plant specimens. The Countess of Ashenmere poured tea, and wore good gowns and smiled at the right moments, and was decorative in the correct rooms. She tried. You must know that she tried. In the early months she tried to learn the part, to find some way of being useful even within its narrow walls. She mentioned once carefully that the kitchen physic was poorly organized, and she could improve it. She observed that the home estate's kitchen garden was underproducing, and she knew methods that might help. She suggested gently that a labourer's family in the estate village had a sick child, and she had preparations that could ease their suffering. Lord Corv heard her out each time. With the patient distaste of a man listening to something he cannot quite bring himself to rebuke, and then turned the conversation elsewhere. It was clear to him, though he never said it plainly, that his wife's knowledge was an embarrassment. An apothecary's daughter with soil, in her upbringing and medicine on her hands, was not what the Earl of Ashenmere wished to explain to his peers, and the more Imogen was herself, the more he wished she would be something else. She stopped trying after a while. There is a point in every such arrangement where a person of sense and pride understands they are not wanted for themselves, and folds quietly away to preserve what dignity remains. Imogen reached that point and went still, and the great gift she carried inside her, the knowledge and the calling her father had spent 20 years building in her, went still with her, with nowhere to go. That might have been the whole of the story. A great many such marriages produce only that, a slow grey extinction of a person behind the role they have been purchased to perform. But there was Lady Portia Wyndham. Lady Portia Wyndham was beautiful, well-connected and furious, and she had been furious for going on 18 months ever since Lord Corv had broken what she considered an understanding and married the apothecary's daughter instead. She had expected to be the Countess of Ashenmere. She had arranged herself for years toward exactly that. She was the right kind of woman for the title. High-born, fashionable, correct, and she had let the world understand that she and Lord Corv were a certainty, which made his choice of a wife who came from trade an insult, not only to her personally, but to everything she represented. Lady Portia was not the kind of woman who absorbed insults quietly. She was the kind who repaid them. She built her campaign with patience over the long months, waiting until Imogen was sufficiently isolated and the social landscape sufficiently prepared. Imogen, friendless in London and unused to the poisoned currents of fashionable life, was not a difficult target. There was a young physician's assistant who came to the house. Imogen had arranged, quietly, to keep a small supply of medicines for the household staff, the one piece of her old life she had managed to salvage, and Lady Portia took this thread and pulled it. A forged letter, in a hand too like Imogen's to be easily disputed, arranged in counters, staged to look private, a word placed in the right ear, then another, and then the slow and poisonous spreading of a thing that has nothing to stop it once it is moving. That the Countess of Ashenmere, that tradesman's girl who had never quite known how to behave, had been seen in circumstances no countess should find herself in. It was a lie from the first syllable to the last. There was nothing between Imogen and any man but her marriage, which she had kept faithfully because she was a faithful person, even in a faithless arrangement. But lies of that particular kind need no truth to travel. They need only a willing audience, and Lady Portia had spent months building one. When Lord Corv heard the whispers, he heard them already half believing. I must say this plainly, because it is the wound at the center of everything that falls, and I will not let you look away from it. He did not believe the rumor because the evidence was compelling. He believed it because believing it was easier than the alternative. The alternative would have required him to stand beside his wife, to investigate, to publicly defend a woman he had spent a year being quietly ashamed of, to say before the world that the apothecary's daughter was his, that he valued her, that he was choosing her over the comfortable opinion of his class. That was the price of disbelieving the rumor. He decided, not in so many words, not in any way he would have admitted to himself, that the price was too high. He confronted Imogen once, briefly. She denied everything, clearly and without weeping, and looked at him with those steady grey eyes and told him what had been done, and by whom, and asked him to find out the truth before he acted on a lie. He looked back at her, and the part of him that was proud and tired, and had never quite forgiven her for not being the kind of wife he had imagined, heard what he had already decided to hear. The matter was settled, he told her. She had disgraced his name, and he intended to remedy it in the most discreet way available to him. He would not pursue a divorce. The scandal of that was worse than the alternative, and beside its spendment. But she would not remain in London where she could disgrace him further. He sent her to Grey Marsh, to the failing estate on the failing coast. He chose it because it was the most quietly wretched of his holdings and the furthest from anything that mattered. He sent her with a small staff, and a letter he did not sign, and when she had gone he closed the door on the matter and considered it finished. She did not beg him when he delivered his decision. "I want you to know that." She heard him out in silence, and at the end she said 4 words, very quietly, in the way of a woman who has decided to be done with persuading and is turning instead to fact. She said, "You will regret this." And then she went to Grey Marsh to be forgotten. The estate was, in those first weeks, everything Lord Corv had intended it to be. The manor house was damp and cold, its rooms barely furnished, the old garden a tangle of dead growth and opportunistic weeds. The village below the house was a dispiriting place. Perhaps 40 families, most of them surviving on what the sea gave them, which was increasingly little, because the boats were aging, and no one with the knowledge to advise them differently had come to that coast in living memory. The people of Grey Marsh were not unfriendly, but they were worn down in the way of folk who have been overlooked for so long that they have stopped expecting anything else. They looked at the displaced countess who had arrived among them with the flat, quiet curiosity of people to whom one more piece of misfortune is barely remarkable. Imogen spent the first 2 weeks in something very close to despair. She sat in the cold house and she grieved. For her name, for her father who was not there to see what had become of his careful arrangements, for the life she had allowed herself to imagine might become something better than it was. It was a grief with nothing self-pitying about it. It was the clean, hard grief of a person who has been genuinely wronged and knows it, and is not quite sure yet how to transform that knowing into something useful. But Imogen Bassett had not been raised to sit still. She went out one morning in the 2nd week, because the walls of the manor were making her worse rather than better, and she walked the coast path in the grey early light. As she walked, she looked at Grey Marsh the way her father had taught her to look at any struggling thing. Not at what was failing, but at what was underneath the failure, waiting. She looked at the old kitchen garden and saw, in the untended sprawl, the bones of something deliberate, the remains of a physic garden, planted perhaps 100 years ago by some former mistress of the house who had known what she was about. The old lavender, ancient and woody but still living, a hedge of wild rosemary along the southern wall. Species she had not expected to find so far north, some of them rare enough that her hands, before her mind had quite caught up, were already pulling at the weeds. She looked at the salt flats, that wide foreshore of seawater channels and shallow pans that had been neglected and flooded into uselessness, and she saw what her father's knowledge of drainage told her they could be. Productive, properly managed, capable of yielding salt of a quality the inland markets would pay well for. She looked at the village, and she saw what it was dying of. Not poverty exactly, though poverty was certainly present, but the specific poverty of people who have been cut off from the knowledge that could help them. They were fishing poorly because no one had taught them better methods. Their children were getting sick and staying sick because there was no dispensary within 12 miles and no one with the knowledge to make even the simplest remedies. Their boats were aging because no one had brought them the techniques that would make a smaller catch last longer and sell for more. She saw all of this, and she understood, with a clarity that was almost violent, what her husband had accidentally done. He had meant to bury her in a useless place. Instead, he had planted her with complete authority. And no one to tell her what a countess did and did not do, in the middle of exactly the kind of work she had been born and trained to do. Every gift she possessed, every year of knowledge her father had poured into her, was precisely suited to what Grey Marsh needed. He had sent her somewhere to disappear. He had sent her to her purpose. She went back to the manor, sat down at the desk in the cold study, and began to make a list. I would need a longer evening to tell you properly about what followed, and some part of me resents that I cannot give it to you, because it is the heart of what Imogen Bassett was. But I will tell you enough. She began with the physic garden, because she always began where she knew most and where her hands were most confident. She spent 3 months restoring and expanding it, working alongside 2 village women she hired and trained, teaching them as she went the way her father had taught her. By the end of the first season, the garden was producing again, tinctures and salves and dried preparations that she distributed through a small dispensary she set up in a room of the manor, open twice a week, free to anyone who could not pay, which was most of them. The sick children who had been sick all winter stopped being sick. The old fisherman with the chest complaint the village had accepted as his fate improved measurably within 6 weeks of the correct preparation, moved along the coast, and people came from 3 settlements over, and Imogen trained 2 of the village women to handle the common cases themselves, so that the knowledge would not leave Grey Marsh if she ever did. Then she turned to the salt flats. She wrote to a practitioner of coastal agriculture her father had corresponded with, and he wrote back at length, and she walked the foreshore with his letters in hand and planned the channels. She hired the men of the village to dig them at fair wages, better than anything the coast had offered in years, and she supervised the work herself, in boots and plain working clothes, in the cold sea wind, knowing every man's name by the end of the first week. The pans were producing by early summer. She arranged a contract with a merchant in the nearest market town, and the price for Grey Marsh salt, clean, well-dried, evenly grained, was better than any the village had seen. Some of the men who had dug the channels reinvested in their boats. The boats were next. She could not teach them fishing herself, but she could bring them someone who could, and she did. An older fisherman from further up the coast, a man her father had known in his wide circuit of useful people, who knew the improved net methods and the preservation techniques, and agreed to spend a season at Grey Marsh, teaching them in exchange for lodging and a fee from the salt tuft. The catches improved within 3 months. The fleet grew from 5 boats to 11 in 18 months, because men from nearby settlements who had heard what was happening at Grey Marsh came to join it. She built a small schoolroom in a converted outbuilding and hired a teacher from the nearest town, covering the fees from the estate accounts, which were, by the 2nd year, no longer a drain on the Ashenmere ledgers but a modest and growing profit. She planted an apple heir of a woman on the south-facing slope behind the manor that would not bear fruit for years, but would be there for whoever came after her, whatever happened to her. She kept her father's notebooks and added to them every week, so that the knowledge would not leave Grey Marsh when she did. And she worked among the people, always, not above them. She was in the dispensary with her sleeves rolled up and her hands in the preparation bowls. She was on the foreshore in all weathers overseeing the salt harvest. She sat with the women sicked to assist in difficult labours and talked through what her father had taught her about the small catastrophes that could be prevented by knowledge and calm hands. She knew the name of every child in the village. She attended the funerals when there were funerals and was genuinely glad at the christenings, and the people of Grey Marsh, who had been abandoned by their absent lord for as long as anyone could remember, gave her in return the one thing she had never once received from the fine world she had been brought into. They trusted her completely. They called her, among themselves, not my lady or her ladyship, but simply Imogen, in the way that people use a name when they mean to say something larger than any title could contain. She had not become what Lord Corv had sent her here to become. She had become what she had always been, given room at last to be it. And the word of what was happening at Grey Marsh travelled, as such word always travels, however far north you try to keep a thing contained. Two things reached Lord Corv in London, within weeks of each other in the 2nd year, and between them they put him on the coast road. The first was the accounts. Grey Marsh had sent nothing but expenditure to the Ashenmere ledgers for 30 years. The first quarterly accounting that showed a profit from the northern coastal estate made his man of business think there had been a clerical error. The second and third confirmed it. Lord Corv sent his steward to investigate, and the steward came back with a report that read, in its careful, formal language, like something that ought to have been impossible: a working physic garden, a dispensary drawing patients from settlements along the surrounding coast, salt flats producing at capacity, an expanded fishing fleet, a school, a village that a man who had visited it 4 years earlier barely recognized, and at the center of all of it, the displaced countess, directing the entire enterprise with a quiet, unhurried authority that had, in the steward's careful phrase, earned her the complete devotion of the local population. That alone might not have moved him. Pride is a slow and heavy thing to shift. But the second thing arrived at nearly the same time, and it moved him in a way the accounts could not. The truth of Late Portia Wyndham's scheme had begun to surface. It surfaced the way such truths do, through the chain of small failures that always, eventually, undoes a lie built on paid silence, a dismissed servant, a guilty conscience grown heavier than the consequence of setting it down. The woman came to the solicitors, and what she confessed was the whole of it. The forged correspondence, the arranged encounters, the careful construction of a scandal out of nothing but malice and thwarted ambition, built by Lady Portia Wyndham to destroy the woman who had taken the title she believed was hers. Lord Corv read the documentation in his study in London. He read it twice, and then he sat very still for a very long time. His wife had been innocent, wholly, provably, entirely innocent, falsely accused by a woman who hated her, and he, her husband, the person most obligated in the world to protect and trust her, had not troubled to find out whether to believe her before he condemned her and sent her away. He did not sleep that night. Pride, when it cracks, does not crack quietly. The flood that came through was shame, the deep, surgical kind that does not grant the comfort of excuses, because you already know all the excuses, and you know quite clearly that none of them are sufficient. He had to go to her. He had no expectation of being received with anything but the cold civility she had every right to offer him. But he could not stay in London knowing what he knew and not go. And so he rode north to Grey Marsh, came around the last bend of the cliff road, heard the hammering, and looked down at the life his wife had built in the grave he had dug for her. He let his horse find its own pace down the cliff road. It was the longest descent of his life. He came into the village through the stares of the people of Grey Marsh, and they were not welcoming stares. They knew who he was. The absent lord whose absence had been the precondition of everything that had failed here before their Imogen came. They watched him ride past with the frank, unperforming wariness of people who have already formed their opinion of a man and are waiting to be persuaded otherwise, without any great expectation that they will be. He found her at the physic garden. She was showing one of the village women the late harvesting of the root preparations, patient and precise, her hands in the dark soil of the bed, her attention entirely on the work. She heard his horse, and she turned and looked at him. And she did not pale, she did not weep, she did not do any of the things that a woman broken by exile might do when the man who broke her arrives without warning. She finished what she was saying to the woman beside her. Then she pulled off her gardening gloves, unhurried, folded them over the handle of her trowel, and walked toward him. He dismounted before she reached him. He got down off his horse and stood on the ground, and he waited. She stopped a few feet away and looked at him in the pale autumn light. Her face was weathered from 2 years of coast wind and outdoor work, and she was wearing the plain, serviceable clothes of a woman who works, and she looked nothing like the composed, carefully unhappy person he had installed in his London drawing rooms. She looked like herself. He understood, looking at her, that he had never actually seen her before. "Lord Corv," she said. Her voice was steady and quite cool. "This is a considerable distance for a visit." "I know the truth of it," he said. "All of it. Lady Wyndham's scheme, the letters, the fabrication, the woman who came forward with the proof. I know that you were innocent when you told me so, and I did not believe you, and I sent you here." Something moved in her face. Not softness, not yet. Something older and quieter, the acknowledgement of a wound carefully reopened. "You did not believe me," she said. "No. I stood in front of you and told you the truth, and you looked at me and chose otherwise. Not because the evidence against me was strong, because it was easier." She held his gaze without effort. "I have had considerable time to think about this, and I want to be precise. The scandal is not the thing you owe me for. Lady Wyndham built the lie, and liars exist in every generation and cannot always be stopped. What you owe me for is that when the lie arrived you had so little regard for your own wife that you did not think the truth of her worth the trouble of finding out. That is the debt. The rest is Lady Wyndham's." He stood with that for a moment. There was nothing to argue, and nothing in him that wished to argue. "I know," he said, "I have no defense to offer you, not a single one that I would insult you by speaking." A pause. "I have come because I intend to clear your name, completely, publicly, before every circle of society that condemned you. I have the proof, and I will use it. To lay Lady Wyndham's scheme before the world that she built it in, and to stand up and declare my wife innocent and wronged and owed a reckoning from every person who repeated a word of what was said of her." He looked at her steadily. "I intend to do this whether you want anything further from me or not. It is owed to you. It was owed 2 years ago, and I will pay it now regardless of what you decide about us." She was quiet for a long moment. The sea wind moved through the physic garden behind her, and the smell of late rosemary and salt came across the small distance between them. "And what," she said slowly, "do you decide about us?" He answered her honestly, because there was nothing left in him capable of being anything else. "I came over this cliff road this morning expecting to find a woman I had harmed. I found instead a woman who has built." He gestured, a slightly helpless gesture that took in the garden, the village below, the working boats in the harbour, the whole living and purposeful enterprise of Grey Marsh. This, in 2 years, in a place I chose because it was the most neglected piece of ground I owned. He drew a breath. "You told me when I sent you away that I would regret it. I did not understand then what you meant. I regret it now, not because the estate is profitable, and not because your innocence has been proved. I regret it because I spent 2 years without knowing what I threw away, and I have come over that cliff road this morning and found out, and I cannot unknow it." A pause. "I think I love my wife. I have come knowing I have not earned the right to that statement. I will leave with whatever you send me away with." Imogen looked at him for a long, considering time. The women at the garden gate were pretending not to watch. They were watching. "Go to London," she said at last. "Do what you said. Clear my name, all of it, every corner of it, and do not leave a shadow. I want Lady Wyndham's scheme known precisely and completely, and I want your voice behind the telling, not an intermediary's." She paused. "And when that is done, if you choose to come back, you will come back as a person learning to earn something. Not as the Earl of Ashenmere inspecting his property, as a man starting from the beginning, on his wife's terms, in her work by her methods. You will learn the dispensary and the salt pans and the names of every family in this village, and you will learn them slowly, because trust is built slowly, and not by declaration." She met his eyes without flinching. "I promise you nothing. I will not tell you the outcome before it has been earned, but the chance. You may have that, if you do what you say, and come back and begin. We shall see what you are made of underneath the pride. I found out what I am made of in this garden. You will find out what you are made of in it as well, if you stay long enough." He bowed his head. Not the formal inclination of a lord, the genuine bow of a man who has understood something at last about where he stands. He went back to London and did exactly as he had promised. He laid Lady Portia Wyndham's entire campaign before the people who had repeated her lies, named her in the documentation with surgical specificity, and stood before the society that had whispered about his wife, and declared her innocent, wronged, and owed a reckoning. Lady Wyndham did not weather it. A woman whose currency is reputation has nothing left to spend when the architecture of her scheming is made public, and the world that had been her stage became a world she could no longer occupy. She retired to the country and was not much looked for, and Lord Corv went back to Grey Marsh. He stayed. That is the part that matters most. He was not good at any of it at first, because pride, once stripped, leaves a man with very little to stand on until he builds something real to replace it. He was clumsy in the dispensary and slow in the garden, and he made mistakes in the names and the methods that the village people noted with the careful, non-committal patience of folk who are waiting to see whether a new start is a real one. He persisted. He was out in the salt pans in the winter cold and in the physic garden in the spring mud, and he was not dignified about any of it, and Imogen did not make it easier for him than it was, because she had promised him no mercy, only the chance. Slowly, in the way that things built on truth are always built, which is not quickly or neatly, he earned it. The village people who had watched him arrive with suspicion began to watch him with something more like consideration, because a man who turns up at 6 in the morning to help repair the harbour wall when the autumn storms come in does not look much like the absent lord who had never troubled to visit. Imogen watched him, warily, and then less warily, and found, as she had cautiously hoped, that the man underneath the dismantled pride was not nothing. He was, in fact, quite a good deal. Intelligent, capable of genuine industry, and, this was the thing that moved her most, genuinely fond of the people he was working beside, in the straightforward way of a man who has discovered, later than he should have, that other people are interesting. They fell in love the long way, the honest way. The way that cannot be purchased or rushed, that has to be built between two people who begin as strangers and become, by the patient accumulation of days and work, and the ordinary courage of choosing each other again and again, something real. They had been married 3 years before they became husband and wife, in any sense that either of them would have counted. And when the children came, 2 of them, in time, a girl first, and then a boy. Imogen raised them at her side in the physic garden, the way her father had raised her, with their hands in the soil, and their heads full of the knowledge that the world calls impractical, and the world cannot live without. Lord Corv watched her do it, and understood that he was watching something be given forward, across generations, that would outlast the earldom and every title he had ever held. Grey Marsh thrived. It is thriving still. Or so the people of that coast will tell you if you find yourself on that road in the right season and ask the right questions. There is a physic garden against the old stone wall that is known to practitioners along the entire northern shore. There is a dispensary that has trained a dozen women in the years since Imogen began it. There is a school and an orchard come into its full bearing now, and a fishing fleet of 17 boats, and the salt from Grey Marsh still commands a better price than any of its neighbours. The Earl of Ashenmere is prouder of his wife than of the earldom, and he will tell you so without hesitation, which is not the kind of thing earls tend to say, and which tells you everything about what 2 years in a salt-wind garden can do to a man's sense of what is worth being proud of. If you ask me what this story is truly about, I will tell you it is about what happens when you take a person who carries a gift and give them, by accident or by cruelty, the one thing they most needed: room to work. Room to be what they are, without anyone measuring them against what they are not. Lord Corv put Imogen in a forgotten place and thought he was putting her in a grave. What he did not understand, what people of his kind so rarely understand, is that a gift like hers is not diminished by difficulty. It is sharpened by it. The hard ground, the cold wind, the people who had nothing and needed everything, these were not obstacles to what she was. They were the conditions she had been made for. He sent her to a place that had nothing. She looked at it with her father's eyes and found everything. You cannot bury a person who carries their knowledge inside them. You can only give them somewhere new to plant it. You have sat with me through a cold marriage and a careful cruelty and the long, salt-aired rising of a woman who was never, not for a single day, as broken as her husband believed. And before you leave this fire, I would ask you to subscribe to Moonlight at Ravenwood, if you have not already. It is free, and it means the next story finds you the moment it is ready. And there is always a next, my dears, and I would very much rather you were there for it. Good night, and if the world should ever try to tell you that where you have been sent is where you will stay, remember Imogen Bassett. Remember what a woman with knowledge and room can make of a forgotten coast. The salt flats do not know what they can yield until the right hand comes to tend them. Neither, in the end, do we.